Club Candy. Chapter 2. The Docks. The air at the docks was a different element. A thick, greasy soup of salt and diesel, of fish rot and industry, a smell that seeped into a man's clothes and laid claim to his soul. For Joseph Reynolds, it was the smell of cruel, capricious salvation. Each morning before the sun had burned the haze off the river, he joined the throng of men, black and white, who gathered at the hiring pens. They were a congregation of desperate souls, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on the foreman who held their day's bread in the casual, contemptuous flick of his wrist. To be chosen was a small, fleeting victory in a long and losing war. To be passed over was a familiar, gnawing defeat that tasted like bile. Today, he'd been chosen. The work was a brutal, relentless catechism of labor, a cycle of loading and unloading, of heaving crates and balancing sacks until his muscles screamed in protest, and the sweat, salty as the sea, stung his eyes. Joe worked with a fierce, contained energy, his movements economical, his face a stony, unreadable mask. He was a good worker, strong and dependable, but he knew that here, on the waterfront, a man's worth was measured by the strength of his back and the weakness of his position. And the black men, they were always in the weakest position, their labor a cheap commodity in a market that had been rigged against them for centuries. He saw Sal Marcone before Sal saw him. The man moved through the grime and chaos of the warehouse with a lazy, predatory grace, his expensive leather shoes a stark, insulting contrast to the filth-caked floor. Sal wasn't a foreman, not officially. He was something else, a shadow creature, a name spoken in whispers. He had connections. He was a man who could make things happen, and a man who could make people disappear. He was, Joe knew with a bone-deep certainty in his blood, a man to be feared. Sal's eyes, small and dark like chips of riverstone, scanned the workers, his gaze a casual dismissal of their humanity. Then they landed on Joe. He beckoned with a slight, arrogant jerk of his head. "Reynolds," Sal said, his voice a smooth, polished veneer over something rough and dangerous. "Walk with me." Joe's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of his own making. He wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers and fell into step beside the man. As they walked, a space cleared around them, an invisible circle of isolation created by the averted eyes and suddenly busy hands of the other workers. To be singled out by Sal Marcone was to be marked, to be cast out from the herd. "You're a quiet man, Reynolds," Sal began, lighting a cigarette, the smoke a pale, ghostly serpent curling from his lips. "You work hard. You keep your head down. I like that. A man who knows his place." Joe said nothing. He kept his eyes fixed on the far wall of the warehouse, his face a carefully constructed mask of impassivity. To show fear was to invite predation. To show anger was to invite destruction. "The thing is," Sal continued, his tone shifting to one of mock confidentiality, "a man like you, a family man, 6 kids, I hear. A man like that can always use a little extra, a little something on the side. Am I right?" Joe's throat was a desert of dust and apprehension. "I make do," he said, the words barely a whisper. Sal chuckled, a low, humorless sound that held no warmth, only contempt. "Making do is for suckers, for the sheep. I'm talking about getting ahead. I got a little job. Easy work. Just need a man who can keep his eyes open and his mouth shut. A lookout." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and pregnant with a terrible, seductive menace. Joe knew what it meant. He'd heard the stories, the whispers that slithered through the docks like river snakes, trucks that went missing at night, cargo that never reached its destination, men who asked too many questions and ended up as catfish food in the Chattahoochee. "I'm not looking for trouble, Mr. Marcone," Joe said, his voice low and steady, a small act of defiance in a sea of surrender. Sal stopped, turning to face him. He took a long, deliberate drag from his cigarette, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Trouble is when you can't feed your kids, Reynolds. Trouble is when your wife looks at you with those tired, disappointed eyes because you ain't enough. This ain't trouble. This is an opportunity. A chance to put some real money in your pocket. The kind of money you ain't ever gonna make hauling crates for the chumps who run this place. Sal's words were a poison dart, dipped in a venom distilled from Joe's own deepest fears and insecurities. He saw Ellie's face, the worry lines etched around her eyes like a fine, cruel embroidery. He saw Joey, his son, his hero worship beginning to curdle into a painful adolescent disillusionment. He felt their needs, the crushing, suffocating burden of his inability to provide the life they deserved, a life that was always just on the other side of a pane of glass he could not break. He thought of the popsicles, a nickel, a goddamn nickel for a piece of frozen sugar water, and it was a treasure as far beyond his reach as the stars. The shame of it burned in his gut, a hot, acidic fire. Sal watched him, a faint knowing smile playing on his lips. He was a master of this game, a connoisseur of human weakness. He could see the surrender in Joe's eyes before Joe himself had fully acknowledged it. "There's a shipment coming in late tonight," Sal said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Textiles, high-end stuff. The truck will be leaving out of Gate 4 around midnight. I just need a man on the corner of Marietta and Parker, a man just having a smoke. If you see a patrol car, you drop your cigarette and grind it out with your shoe. That's it. Easy." Joe's mind was a maelstrom of fear and rationalization. It was a small thing, a simple act, just standing on a corner. But he knew, with a soul-deep certainty, that it was a step onto a path from which there might be no return. It was a bargain, a trade of his quiet, hard-won integrity for a promised few dollars, a promise that was probably a lie. He looked past Sal, at the endless rows of crates and boxes, at the other men toiling in the dim, dusty light, their backs bent in a posture of perpetual submission. This was his life. A lifetime of breaking his body for another man's profit. A lifetime of making do. And for what? So his children could press their faces against a store window, their hearts aching for a world they could never enter. The weight on his shoulders, being a husband, a father, a black man in a white man's world, a weight he carried every single day, suddenly felt unbearable. And in that moment, the weight of Sal Marcone's offer felt, impossibly, like a chance to finally set some of it down. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of surrender that felt like a betrayal of every ancestor who had endured worse with their dignity intact. "All right," he said, the word tasting like rust and resignation in his mouth. "I'll be there." Sal clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that was not friendly, but proprietary. It was a brand. "I knew you were a smart man, Reynolds, a real smart man." As Sal walked away, his expensive shoes leaving faint prints in the grime, Joe stood frozen for a moment, the greasy air thick in his lungs. The noise of the warehouse seemed to fade into a distant, mocking roar. He had crossed a line he had not even been able to see until he was on the other side of it. He could feel it, a tremor deep in the bedrock of his soul. The weight on his shoulders hadn't lessened. It had only changed its shape, twisting itself into a new and more terrible burden. Next episode, Chapter 3, Kool-Aid.